In early 1988, a series of pediatric consultations in West Virginia recorded an anomaly. Multiple children across Boone County had stopped sleeping altogether. Despite their wakefulness, none showed signs of fatigue or cognitive disruption. Teachers described them as unusually focused. Parents, increasingly concerned, reported that their children no longer blinked. As the months passed, the children continued to function without sleep. They advanced academically, spoke with unusual precision, and, in several cases, began referring to themselves by names that did not match their records. By the age of 14, all of them had become near silent, attending school occasionally before dropping it entirely. Then, between 1988 and 1991, they began disappearing, not all at once, but in a precise sequence that matched the order of their births. Their names were never found in security logs, birth certificates, or school logs. In a sealed health department note, one entry appeared next to each vanished name saying, "Phase complete, remove from rotation." Were these children part of an abandoned state study, or were they never supposed to exist at all? If you're drawn to archives like this one, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more hidden cases. The first report came from a nurse practitioner named Louise Allen, working in the rural township of Darnell Hollow, West Virginia. She wasn't alarmed at first. A boy named Mason Tully, age 9, had gone 3 nights without sleep. No fever, no trauma, no hyperactivity. He just stayed awake. He'd lie in bed, arms folded, eyes open, whispering quietly to himself. His mother, Deborah, said he'd blink, breathe, and even answer questions, but he wouldn't close his eyes, not even to rest. 2 days later, another boy, then a girl, different families, different schools, no shared relatives or overlapping schedules, and none of the children were related to the Tullys. By the end of the week, 6 cases, none of them slept, and none of them seemed to need to. At first, local physicians blamed caffeine, stress, or simple lying, but the truth was harder to explain. Teachers noticed increased attention spans. One parent reported that her daughter began speaking more clearly, as if her thoughts had reorganized themselves overnight, except, of course, there had been no night for her, just a long, uninterrupted stretch of awareness. Police were notified, though there was no crime to investigate. County health officials conducted brief interviews, finding no history of medication or known illness. All 6 children had visited the same pediatric office within the last 6 months, Dr. Felix Harmon's clinic on Route 17, but Harmon denied anything unusual in his care. He was found reviewing files late one night, trying to identify common threads. His notes mention one detail that wasn't in the official reports. Each child, on their last recorded well visit, had stared intently at a medical poster on the wall, a schematic of the human brain. Not unusual, except all of them made the same comment: "That's not the real shape." Within 2 weeks, the number of sleepless children rose to 12, and still, no fatigue, no hallucinations, just calm, quiet wakefulness. On March 9th, a parent named Daniel Ross took his son Benjamin to St. Mary's in Charleston, insisting something neurological was going undetected. The hospital ran a 48-hour EEG. Results came back inconclusive. The boy's brain showed normal delta wave patterns, the kind associated with deep sleep, even though he hadn't shut his eyes in 5 days. Ross described the moment doctors tried to sedate the boy. The IV drip was administered. Vitals remained stable. But Benjamin just sat up, blinked slowly, and said, "This one's not mine." The nurse discarded the remaining sedative. Later testing revealed the dosage hadn't registered in his blood. By mid-March, the county board called an informal meeting. No press, no public disclosure, just 13 parents and 2 school administrators. A former child psychologist named Margaret Voss attended as a favor to one of the families. She noted in her journal, later acquired through FOIA request, that the children were not exhibiting insomnia, but something altogether foreign. Their cognition has evolved past the need to close off the senses. Local radio ran a single public service message asking parents to report any extended wakefulness in minors. It aired once at 4:12 a.m. and was never played again. Station logs show no entry for the file. Even the technician on duty denied scheduling it. The children continued attending school, though most teachers were instructed not to speak with them directly. One principal began separating the sleepless students from others during recess. They didn't protest, they simply stood near the fence, looking at the tree line, sketching something faint into the dirt with their shoes. A teacher, name withheld from official transcripts, later described what disturbed her most. They weren't behaving like children who couldn't sleep. They were behaving like children who had already moved past it. And it was around this time that parents began to find the drawings, folded paper under pillows, notes in the margins of schoolwork. The lines were crude but deliberate, not just shapes or scribbles. They were maps, and none of them matched any place in West Virginia. The first drawing was dismissed as daydreaming, a winding path sketched in blue ink with crude arrows pointing toward a square marked end. A parent found it beneath their daughter's pillow, folded into quarters. It had no title, no label, just a line of numerals printed faintly at the bottom. 003 Sol V. A few days later, another parent found something similar. Then an other. Within 2 weeks, over a dozen families, all of them with children who had stopped sleeping, reported finding similar drawings. None of them had seen their children making them. The sketches varied slightly, but the patterns were consistent. Long corridors, odd geometric loops, roads leading to abrupt stops, buildings with no entrances. Some had staircases that ended mid-air. Others featured repeating grid patterns with no clear function or orientation. Most striking was the perspective. These weren't bird's-eye maps or childlike doodles. The angles were oblique, architectural even. A retired contractor named Walter Straighton, whose grandson was among the sleepless, remarked that the scale ratios weren't guesswork. In his words, whoever drew these understood space, not just shape, flow. Local authorities were slow to respond. When pressed, school administrators claimed they had no control over what students brought from home. A counselor recommended the drawings be discarded to avoid feeding into shared fantasy. But some parents didn't discard them. They began collecting the maps, comparing them. A quiet network formed, unspoken, unofficial. Drawings were laid out on kitchen tables, photographed, annotated. Patterns emerged, repeating symbols, identical angles, and, eventually, fragments that connected like puzzle pieces. One mother noted that 3 separate drawings from children on opposite sides of the county fit together to form a large spiraling hallway. At the center, a circular chamber marked with a single X. By late April, the maps began including exterior features, tree lines, access roads, radio towers. One map featured what appeared to be a communications dish. Another had a structure labeled signal box, east face. That same term appeared in 3 other unrelated drawings. The only real-world correlation came from a 1961 military survey map of Boone and Kanawha counties, now declassified. A single unlabeled sector, marked as a blank plot, matched the topography sketched in several of the children's drawings. That plot was once designated as FM-33, a short-term communication site used during early Cold War signal relay experiments. Officially closed in 1972, officially dismantled. But the drawings continued to reference it, directly. A teacher attempted to confiscate one map during class. She reported that the student did not react emotionally, nor did he try to stop her. He simply said, "It won't draw right for you." When she later tried to photocopy the page for school records, the copier produced a black sheet with no image. A few weeks later, a 5th grader named Aaron Mays was found sleepwalking, despite not having slept for over 40 days. He'd left his house sometime before dawn and was discovered at a construction site 3 miles away, crouched in the mud, using a stick to trace lines into the dirt. His hands were shaking. A deputy's report noted that Aaron had written the word Bay 4 times in different corners. There is no known location by that name in the area. The boy didn't respond to questions. He was escorted home without incident. The next morning, his parents found a new drawing tucked into the couch cushions, this time in red pen, the paper damp and smudged. It showed the same spiraling corridor as before, but with annotations now. Short phrases in block letters: "We listened," "Stay low," and at the center, a single circle shaded entirely black, labeled "The quiet part." Medical professionals urged caution. Psychologists recommended evaluating the children for early-onset schizophrenia. But blood panels, neuroimaging, and behavioral diagnostics came back normal, if anything, disturbingly so. One child summed it up better than any adult could. When asked why he kept drawing these places, he said, "Because it's where we're supposed to be." And in the following days, the drawings stopped appearing. Not because the children stopped making them, but because they started hiding them somewhere else. Dr. Charles Redner wasn't a man prone to exaggeration. At 58, he'd spent most of his professional life as a pediatrician in Boone County, known for his methodical demeanor and reluctance to speculate. He kept handwritten notes, still used a tape recorder for field visits, and filed everything in duplicate. His practice served rural families spread across the hollows and back roads, and he was trusted. On March 18, 1988, Redner made a routine round of home visits, 3 in total. 3 children whose parents had requested checkups after several nights of sleeplessness, though by then, the pattern had already been noted in local whispers. Redner visited the Langley home first, then the Morales family, and finally, the Wexlers. All 3 lived within a 10-mile radius of one another. All 3 children were between the ages of 8 and 10, and all 3 had reportedly not slept in over a week. In his report, Redner noted that the children were calm, responsive, and medically stable. No elevated heart rates, no signs of fatigue. He performed routine reflex tests, eye exams, and a modified sleep deprivation screening. The results, he said, were not abnormal, but not quite normal either. What unsettled him wasn't what he found, but what he didn't. No twitching, no irritability, no mental fog. The children responded to questions quickly and precisely. They remembered details most kids wouldn't. One recited the serial number on the back of Redner's stethoscope after glancing at it for less than a second. Still, Redner didn't consider it an emergency. He chalked it up to an unusual cluster of adolescent insomnia and planned to file the visits under behavioral monitoring. That changed when he tried to review his recordings. He'd used the same Olympus microcassette recorder he always did. Clicked on at the start of each visit, clicked off before he left. But when he sat down that night to transcribe the notes, every tape, all 3, was compromised. Each started with a few seconds of muffled ambient sound. Redner greeting the parents, the shuffle of his bag, the scrape of a chair, and then, abruptly, static, thick, dense, and uninterrupted. He tried fast-forwarding, rewinding. The static persisted. No voices, no room tone, just a uniform wash of noise. He checked the machine. It functioned normally on new tapes. The interference was isolated to those 3. Redner contacted the manufacturer. Olympus claimed the tapes could have been magnetically wiped, but the erasure was too clean. No warping, no bleed over. It was, in their words, a deliberate and total overwrite. A week later, Redner attempted a second round of visits. All 3 families declined. 2 wouldn't return his calls. 1, the Wexlers, moved out of the county entirely by early April, leaving behind a mailbox with no forwarding address. Their house sat vacant until the following year. Redner wrote a private letter to the West Virginia Medical Review Board outlining his concerns. In it, He described the children as present but not entirely here, and noted his fear that they were part of something already in motion. The letter was never formally filed. A photocopy was recovered in 1996, folded between pages of an unrelated rural case study on pesticide exposure. The only other surviving note in Redner's file was a post-it, affixed to the cover of the Morales chart. It read, in block letters, "Auditory pattern matching. Ask again." No one knows what the phrase referred to. In a phone interview conducted years later, Redner said the experience shifted something in how he approached patients. Not because he believed anything overtly dangerous had happened, but because something intended had happened, and he had missed it. He left family practice the following spring and moved into a teaching role. His recordings were quietly destroyed. The tape deck itself was boxed and donated to a medical library, where it remains in storage, unlabeled, among other discarded equipment from discontinued casework. To this day, no official medical documentation from that week lists the words insomnia, sleepless, or hallucination. The only consistent diagnosis filed across all three charts was, patient is awake. The room had no official designation, no number on the door, no light fixture in the hallway pointing to its use. It was built sometime during the 1968 expansion of Darnell Hollow Elementary, a concrete box wedged between the cafeteria storage and the old HVAC risers. Originally intended for mop buckets and broken chairs, it had long since been left alone. No teachers used it. Most didn't know it existed, until the children found it. Cliff Morrow, the school's head custodian, first noticed the change on April 2nd. It was a Thursday. Rainy. He passed by the corridor behind the gym and heard soft movement. Not voices, not footsteps, just the drag of shoes and something else, a slow, rhythmic scribble. He opened the door halfway. Inside sat 7 children, all seated cross-legged against the far wall, all facing the same corner. None of them turned to look at him. They each held paper in their laps and were drawing. Fast, deliberate strokes, using cheap blue ink ballpoints from the front office. The sound was unmistakable. Pen against paper. Dozens of short lines overlapping, layered like scaffolding. Morrow didn't say anything. He watched for maybe 10 seconds, then closed the door. Later that afternoon, he mentioned it to Vice Principal Harden, who asked if the children were causing damage. "No," Morrow said, "just concentrating." They returned the next day, and the day after that, always during the lunch period. No teacher had sent them. No attendance records marked them missing. The school counselor, Ms. Ridder, tried speaking to 2 of the students later that week. Neither acknowledged being in the room. One claimed she spent lunch in the library, which was locked for repairs that entire month. By the second week, there were more of them. 10, then 13. When Morrow entered again the following Monday, the children were gone. The room was silent, but the walls weren't empty anymore. 13 sheets of white paper had been nailed into the cinder block using upholstery tacks, the kind used in classroom corkboards. Each page displayed a nearly identical corridor, not a hallway in the school, not anything recognizable. The corridors were narrow and featureless, with long horizontal lines that curved too subtly to measure by hand. There were no doors, no windows, just numbered corner markings, B1, B2, C4, then D6. The numbering stopped abruptly on the final sheet, replaced by a shaded circle labeled Drop. Morrow brought the drawings to administration. Harden glanced at them and said they were likely part of an art project, or maybe just kids playing Cold War. When Morrow asked whether they should be removed, Harden shrugged and said, "If they're back tomorrow, let them be. At least they're quiet." They returned every day that week. Staff became used to it. No one disturbed them. Teachers noted an unusual discipline among the group. They no longer disrupted class, no longer asked questions. They completed their assignments with minimal error and spent most of their time glancing at the clock. Then, on April 17th, the drawings were gone. All 13 removed without trace. The tax remained, but the pages had vanished. Morrow assumed Harden took them. Harden denied it. So did the council. Or, so did the teachers. No student admitted to touching the papers. That same week, a delivery driver reported seeing several students standing at the tree line near the rear faculty lot, pointing at the wooded ridge just beyond the school's northern boundary. When asked what they were looking at, one of them said, "The real hallway, the deep one, the one we don't have to draw anymore." Within 2 days, 2 of those children would stop speaking entirely, not out of trauma, but out of choice. They never returned to the room, and neither did anyone else. The door was later padlocked by school officials, though no formal order was ever signed. When questioned about it in 1994, former staff claimed they simply didn't want anyone finding that space again. The room remains sealed to this day. The first name appeared in the lower right corner of a map recovered from Mrs. Fuller's classroom wastebasket. It was written in neat block letters, all uppercase, Echo 4. At first, she thought it was the title of a game or perhaps a made-up brand, but the child who had drawn it, Jamie Wexler, insisted that wasn't a title. It was his name. She corrected him. He didn't argue, just nodded and repeated, "That's what they call me, this time." By the following week, 6 other maps turned up with similar signatures: Hollow 7, Scale T, Unit 0.9, Redfield, Key 4, and Frameless. None matched the children's birth names. None appeared in school records, IEP forms, or known aliases. Teachers initially assumed it was a shared prank, maybe a television reference or something from comic books. But when one guidance counselor attempted to confront the students, they grew oddly cooperative. One of them, a quiet girl named Eliza, produced a folder from her backpack containing 12 maps. Each was signed with a different code. She had grouped them in plastic sleeves by symbol, not by stud, and on the back of each page in small pencil handwriting, she had written what appeared to be entries, time logs, directional changes, and what she called adjustments. When asked who had given her the names, she said simply, "We all remembered them at different times, but they're the same as before." There was no further elaboration. Parents began to notice the changes in behavior too. Not violent, not withdrawn, but unusually formal. Several children began referring to themselves in the third person during minor conversations. One mother overheard her son say, "Unit 0 doesn't like that color," while sorting laundry. When corrected, he paused for a moment, then repeated, "I meant me." More unsettling was what they wrote when unsupervised. A set of worksheets turned in by a boy named Kyle had been filled out correctly, math problems solved, spelling exercises completed, but the name line read Node 3 in 3 separate assignments. When the teacher crossed it out and told him to redo it, he copied the entire assignment again without protest and re-signed it the same way. Attempts to correlate these code names with anything official turned up nothing. No matches in state databases, no pattern in the way they were formed. Some used numbers, others didn't. Some had military structure, echo, unit, node, while others were harder to classify. One simply read, behind. A local journalist, Michelle Briggs, began a quiet investigation in May after her niece came home with the name Surface Trace written in the margins of her drawing. Briggs filed a FOIA request to search for these terms in Cold War-era intelligence records. Months later, she received a partial packet from a 1958 satellite telemetry program, Operation Hollow Trace, whose purpose remained redacted. It had been funded for just 3 years, then quietly dissolved. One fragment referenced nonverbal identification tagging and temporary nomenclature mapping. The document was unsigned. Briggs never published her findings. She was let go from the paper less than a year later under financial restructuring. In a private interview years afterward, she said, "The names didn't come from the kids were recovering them." Administrators at Darnell Hollow Elementary made small changes to school policy. Students were required to use full legal names on all documents. Any unsigned papers were to be discarded. One teacher was disciplined for keeping copies of the coded drawings in her desk drawer. She left her position shortly after, without notice. Still, the names kept appearing. In the corners of math notebooks, inside library books, even once carved faintly into the underside of a cafeteria tray. Echo 4, recalled. And none of the children could explain what the words meant. Only that they weren't made up. Only that they were used before. By the time the school year ended, two things became clear. The children no longer answered to the names they were given, and no one could agree on when that shift had actually begun. The drawings had become too structured to ignore. By late spring, the coded maps submitted by the children showed consistent architectural logic. Curved corridors, equidistant stairwells, repeating sectors labeled with letters and numerals. What disturbed the school board wasn't the detail, but the uniformity. 13 students from different classrooms and grade levels were producing diagrams with nearly identical layouts, down to the number of wall segments between junctions. In mid-May, Superintendent Harold Ives quietly reached out to the county engineering office under the guise of planning facility repairs. He submitted 4 drawings, anonymized, and asked if anyone on staff recognized the structure. Most dismissed them as imaginative. One didn't. David Harrow, a retired land surveyor brought in as a consultant, paused halfway through reviewing the documents. He asked Ives where the drawings had come from. Ives didn't answer. Harrow tapped the edge of one page with his pen and said, "This looks like FM-33. The name meant nothing to the superintendent. Harrow explained it had been a Cold War satellite relay and frequency monitoring site built into the ridge south of Flatlick Hollow, operational between 1959 and 1972. It was part of a short-lived defense program focused on passive listening, intercepting low-orbit telemetry signals, mapping audio distortion, and testing how architecture affected long-wave propagation." Officially, FM-33 had been dismantled in '72 after the signal infrastructure was deemed obsolete. The land was turned over to the State Forestry Department and eventually reclassified as an unused woodland parcel. No remaining structures were noted in county records. Harrow hadn't thought about the place in over a decade. But the drawings told a different story. According to Harrow, certain elements stood out, like the absence of 90-degree angles in the facility's corridors and the deliberate avoidance of parallel walls. These were signal control measures, designed to prevent wave reflection and standing noise. They weren't random shapes, they were engineered. He described one feature in particular, the signal bay, a concrete sublevel lined with sound-dampening foam and no internal lighting. It was built to record silence, not voice traffic, but what happened between transmissions. Harrow remembered it because no one was allowed inside unaccompanied. It was also the only chamber in the site with a reinforced door that opened inward, not outward. The children had drawn that door exactly. Ives asked if the facility had ever been photographed. Harrow said no, not publicly. Cameras were banned on site, and most blueprints were shredded when the program shut down. But some original documentation had been archived in a defunct civil storage office, now consolidated into a regional warehouse. 2 weeks later, Ives sent a quiet request to access the building for ILAs. The response came back delayed, then denied. A clerk cited incomplete cataloging, noting that no records under FM-33 were listed in the current system. Even the parcel's original construction permits had been replaced with redacted entries labeled "Review Not Required." Frustrated, Ives asked Harrow to visit the site itself. They drove up a gravel access road that hadn't been maintained in years. The path was overgrown, and several markers were missing. Harrow eventually recognized a rusted utility box near a split in the ridgeline. the last known point before the facility's buried entrance. But there was nothing there. No hatch, no fence, just an expanse of ground where the earth had slumped slightly, like something beneath had caved in years ago. A single steel pole remained embedded in concrete, tilting slightly. It bore no logo, no number, just 3 faint letters scratched into the surface. SPE. Harrow couldn't explain it. He was certain they were standing in the right place. He described walking through that very slope a dozen times. Now, it was soil and wind. Later that month, Harrow received a typed letter in the mail. It was unsigned. It read, "There is no record of a facility by that name. You are recalling the layout of a communications shelter that was never built." Harrow never responded. He left the county that summer and never returned. Back at the school, a teacher noticed something new. The children had stopped drawing corridors. They were now sketching rooms, sealed ones. In June, the superintendent's office quietly arranged a second site visit. After the failed trip with Harrow, questions lingered. If FM-33 had truly existed, if the children's drawings were accurate and not coincidental, then the terrain should have shown something. Infrastructure doesn't disappear. Concrete doesn't rot. Power junctions don't vanish without removal loss. This time, the team included a county GIS technician, a forestry liaison, and a part-time investigator from the Department of Public Safety. The plan was straightforward. Revisit the presumed location with updated topographic overlays, confirm the exact GPS coordinates, and document any remaining artifacts of construction, foundations, rebar, vent shafts, anything. They never reached it. The original path, a narrow access road once used by maintenance vehicles, no longer appeared on official maps. Satellite imagery showed uninterrupted tree canopy, no trail, no break in vegetation. Ground-penetrating radar offered no sign of previous grading. According to updated forestry surveys, that section of land had been classified as untouched growth since 1953. The GIS tech flagged the discrepancy immediately. Archived parcel data from the 1970s clearly showed a development stamp, but the digital overlay, updated in 2002, had retroactively removed it, not redacted, but rewritten, as if the site had never been surveyed at all. Still, they walked. Rough coordinates from Harrow's notes led them through thickets and uneven terrain, uphill, along what might have once been a service ridge. After nearly 2 hours of navigating fallen brush and rock clusters, the group came upon a clearing, unnatural in shape, flat and circular, with no obvious cause. In the center stood a single object, a rusted metal post, no taller than 3 feet, set into a poured concrete base. The concrete had cracked but not shifted, and a thin wire ring lay embedded just below the surface, likely grounding for an old perimeter fence. On the post was a metal plate, bolted in with rounded screws. The plate had no government insignia, no agency name, just a serial number etched in industrial lettering, FM-33, awake, no one could explain it. The forestry liaison said no such marker had been reported during P.O. Evious timber surveys. The DPS representative, initially skeptical, took several photographs and called them problematic. Back at the station, when he attempted to print the images, the plate came out blank, just a grey smear where the serial should have been. The marker wasn't catalogued in any database. It wasn't tied to a registered facility. It didn't match Army Corps standards or state-issued signage. Even the screw heads were unfamiliar. Not slotted, not Phillips. Smooth, with no visible entry point. The report from the site visit was never officially filed. The technician who drafted it later said she was told to leave the folder open and not chase down unsupported coordinates. But the superintendent kept a copy, handwritten, tucked inside an old ledger. He also kept one of the group's printouts, a grainy map overlay showing the ridgeline distorted, as if the elevation had been smudged by hand. At the center of the distortion was a faint depression marked zero point zero May. That summer, a second marker was discovered, this time by hikers, roughly 200 yards downslope. It bore no serial, just a welded line of text. Re-entry unconfirmed. Standby quiet. No further site visits were approved. Back at the school, one of the children, the same girl who once labeled herself Key 4, was found sketching circles in her workbook margins. Not tunnels, not rooms, just rows of circles, each with a slash through the center. When asked what they meant, she said, "Those are the places they forgot to erase." She did not elaborate. No one pressed her. The drawings became more fragmented after that, less spatial, more symbolic, grid-like notations, sound wave patterns, and repeated use of one word, written in all caps. Awake. The first report came on July the 8th. Jamie Wexler, age 9, was reported missing from his home on Ridgeway Avenue. His mother found his bed neatly made, clothes, folded at the footboard, which was unusual. Jamie never folded anything. The window was locked from the inside, the front door untouched. No signs of struggle, no noise during the night. The only thing she noticed was a temperature drop. She described it later to the sheriff's deputy as a cold patch, directly where Jamie had been sleeping. Not the whole room, just the mattress itself, which remained cool to the touch for over an hour after she called 911. Authorities issued a local bulletin. No Amber Alert. He was assumed to be a runaway, possibly hiding out with a friend. No foul play was suspected. Officers canvassed nearby homes, checked bus terminals, logged his name into the state system. 3 days later, Mason Tully disappeared. Same conditions. Bed untouched. Shoes beside it. No witnesses. The family dog, typically loud, territorial, didn't bark. The back gate was still latched in the morning. Deputies widened their search. Helicopters, trail dogs, nothing turned up. By July 15th, 5 children were gone. Each disappearance followed the same pattern: silent, undisturbed exits, no forced entry, no physical trace. Parents began staying up through the night in shifts, watching over their kids. Some took photographs every hour, proof of presence, but none of it stopped what was happening. Then someone noticed the order. It was Mrs. Fuller, a substitute math teacher who had catalogued the children's drawings in March, the ones with strange signatures. She pulled out a copy of the first group sketch collected from Eliza Trent's folder. 13 names, each written next to a drawn figure, spaced in a semicircle. The figures were rudimentary, ovals for heads, lines for limbs, but the names were clear. Echo 4, Hollow 7, Scale T, Unit 0.9, Redfield, and so on. The children who had vanished matched the first 5 positions, left to right. It wasn't alphabetical, it wasn't age-based, it was positional, a visual sequence embedded in a sketch made months prior, before any disappearances, before most adults even believed something unusual was happening. The 6th name on the sketch was Key 4, Eliza Trent. Her parents were informed. Deputies began rotating cars outside their home. 2 officers remained parked at the curb overnight. The Trent family moved Eliza's bed to the living room. She slept between them on the couch, beneath a switched-on floor lamp and a battery-powered baby monitor. At 4:11 a.m., the lamp flickered. The monitor clicked. The sound wasn't static, just a brief mechanical hum, like a recorder being rewound. It lasted 2 seconds. When the parents opened their eyes, the blanket was still there. So were the pillows. But Eliza was gone. Officers on watch reported nothing unusual. Surveillance footage from a camcorder left facing the living room recorded 9 hours of stillness. When reviewed, one frame, just one, showed the blanket slightly raised at the center, as if something had just stood up. The timestamp was unreadable. At this point, the school board made an unusual decision. They suspended all student records for the affected families. Withdrawals were quietly processed under non-attendance, guardian relocation. When a parent asked for transfer paperwork, they were told it was being handled through Charleston. Charleston denied involvement. When pressed in a closed-door meeting, a representative from the Department of Education stated that no enrolled students have been reported missing. He provided a typed list of names. None of the vanished children were on it. Not crossed out, not redacted. They simply weren't there. In the weeks that followed, parents stopped reporting disappearances. Some relocated without explanation, others stayed quiet. One mother, when approached by investigators, simply said, "They took their turns, the rest are waiting." No one knew who she meant by they, but everyone understood what she meant by turns. The substitute's name was Denise Palmer. She'd been brought in from outside the county, Kanawha District, to cover for 2 faculty members who left mid-term under quiet circumstances. No public explanation was offered, no formal resignation letters. Just 2 vacant positions and a string of missed emails. Palmer had 31 years of experience, mostly in special education. She was organized, meticulous, and accustomed to chaotic postings. She arrived with a clipboard, a manila folder of district forms, and a habit of double-checking everything. It was during her 3rd week that she asked to see the permanent class rosters, not just for the homeroom she was covering, but historical attendance for the prior year. She claimed some of the students she'd met didn't appear in the current gradebook. When told they'd likely transferred, she insisted that wasn't the issue. "It's not that they're missing," she said. "It's that they were never here." She highlighted 8 names she hadn't seen on any official roll call, but could describe in full: appearance, desk placement, behavior. One boy, she said, always sat near the window and tapped his pencil twice before answering a question. Another, a girl with a limp, carried a composition notebook with a silver 4 drawn on the cover. The principal, Mr. Lane, asked how she could know that if they weren't on the attendance sheets. Palmer hesitated, then said, "Because I've taught them before. But not here." She couldn't remember which district, couldn't name the school. She just remembered their faces, their posture, their timing. She claimed it was like seeing someone you recognize from a dream, too vivid to be a coincidence, too contextless to confirm. Lane asked her to drop it. Palmer didn't. Instead, she contacted a former colleague, Sarah Nelligan, now a registrar in a nearby county. She asked her to run the 8 names through archived rosters, going back 5 years. Nothing turned up, not as students, not even as applica. That's when she requested the student ID photos. Lane sent them through the internal system. But when Palmer opened the files, the entries were blank. Grey placeholder silhouettes, no upload dates, no metadata. Most were labeled IMG00. Frustrated, Palmer began comparing group photos, class composites, yearbook pages, staff hallway displays. She marked the same children in multiple frames. In one 2nd grade photo, a boy she knew as Derek was seated in the front row. In a 4th grade photo taken 2 years later, he hadn't aged. Same haircut, same expression, same shoes. She brought this to Lane. He reviewed the images and saw no issue. Said she was confusing siblings or misremembering who she'd taught. Palmer disagreed. She printed out side-by-side comparisons and brought them to the faculty lounge. 2 other teachers recognized the children immediately, but when they attempted to recall specifics, classroom behavior, assignments, even handwriting, nothing came. Just a fog of vague impressions. One described it like this: "I know their faces, I just can't place them in time." Palmer compiled her findings into a typed memo and submitted it to the district office. It was never acknowledged. Her follow-up calls were rerouted. Her login credentials were disabled the following week. When she returned to the school to retrieve her personal effects, the student portraits in the hallway had been updated. The frames were new, the groupings reorganized. None of the children she'd identified were visible. In the break room, a laminated calendar displayed the school year's theme: "Every child counts." Someone had crossed out "every" in permanent marker and written "the right." Palmer didn't return. She moved to Beckley and began substitute teaching at a private charter school. In a phone interview years later, she was asked if she remembered any of the missing names. She said, I'd know. But she still remembered the faces, and she still remembered how quiet they were. The tape was found by accident. On the evening of August the 12th, Marlene Greeley was cleaning out her son's bedroom, organizing clothes he no longer wore, sorting school folders, checking drawers he always forgot to empty. Her son, Owen, had been one of the quieter cases. He hadn't vanished, hadn't drawn any maps in the margins of his notebooks. But he had stopped sleeping, and over the past month he'd become increasingly silent, not withdrawn, just indifferent. He no longer asked for anything. He simply waited. The VHS tape was unlabeled. No markings, no sleeve, just a plain cassette tucked behind a stack of old board games in Owen's bottom dresser drawer. Marlene assumed it was an old home recording, maybe something he'd taped off the television. She inserted it into the VCR in the living room, expecting static or an overwritten cartoon. The footage began in complete darkness. No audio, no time code, just a faint shifting of light, as if the camera were adjusting to the absence of contrast. Slowly, a tunnel came into view. Long, narrow, made of smooth concrete, the kind of hallway used in utility corridors or service bunkers. The ceiling was low. There were no visible bulbs, no external light source. And yet the tunnel was visible. Then the children appeared. One by one, they stepped into frame, silent, walking single file. Each child moved at an identical pace, arms at their sides, eyes forward. The image quality was grainy, but not distorted. The children were recognizable, too much so. Marlene paused the tape and called out her husband. Together, they reviewed the footage. At least 4 of the children had been reported missing from the district that summer. One, a girl named Cassidy Trent, was wearing the same sweater she'd worn in the school composite photo. Another, boy, seen only in profile, bore a striking resemblance to Jamie Wexler. None of them looked confused. None of them looked frightened. They just walked. Roughly 4 minutes into the recording, the lead child stopped. The others followed suit, pausing in a perfect line. Then the second-to-last child turned his head slightly toward the camera. He didn't blink, didn't smile, just mouthed a single phrase, "Don't wake up." No sound accompanied the words, but the motion was unmistakable. Marlene ejected the tape and drove to the sheriff's office that same night. Deputy Shane Colburn received the tape and filed it into evidence. He reviewed it twice and wrote a brief summary in his report. But when he attempted to duplicate the footage for analysis, every copy came back blank. Not black, blank. The tape would play, but it contained no data. The original cassette remained functional. Colburn reached out to the Department of Public Safety for advice. A state technician was dispatched 2 days later. He viewed the footage, confirmed the visibility of at least 3 missing children, and collected the cassette. 2 weeks later, the Greeleys received a letter. It bore no return address, just a single sentence printed in the center of the page. There is no confirmed footage of any enrolled student beyond June 1988. Colburn was never contacted again. The evidence file for the tape was marked "Withdrawn pending verification." The Greeleys were told the tape had been misplaced during transfer. They never saw it again. Owen stopped speaking entirely a few days later, not out of fear, just quiet, full refusal. He would write only 1 sentence on his school worksheets for the rest of the semester. "You were never meant to see it." The Greeleys pulled him from school in early September. When asked why, Marlene said, "Because it wasn't a warning. It was a reminder." The man never gave his full name. He contacted Michelle Briggs, the same former reporter who had investigated the code names months earlier, through an unmarked envelop left at her post office box. No return address, no signature, just a typed note. FM 33 was not the first. Building C, 1963 to 1965. Look into Section Delta. Briggs followed the lead quietly. Public archives held no reference to Building C, at least not in connection with West Virginia, but a former base directory listed a demolished research compound under the jurisdiction of the now-defunct Aeromedical Testing Division, once operated out of a decommissioned Air Force annex in Pulaski County, Virginia. Among internal references, Sector C, Child Wakefulness Studies. Briggs sent out inquiries under the Freedom of Information Act. Most returned blank or redacted, but 3 weeks later, she received a call from an unlisted number. The man on the other end identified himself only as a former contractor involved in architecture and sensory design. He refused to meet in person, and the call was cut off twice mid-sentence. What he described was a trial referred to internally as CSP, continuity of sleep perception. It wasn't about sleep deprivation. It was about interrupting the need for sleep, isolating and mapping dream state cognition while subjects remained conscious. The premise was that under controlled lighting, noise calibration, and chemical microdosing, children between the ages of 7 and 11 could be guided into a sustained, non-sleep dream state, measurable through observation rather than REM scans. He said it wasn't a myth, it wasn't theoretical. It worked. The test group, no more than 15 subjects at a time, was kept inside a sound-controlled structure known informally as Building C. No windows, 3 doors. Every surface was acoustically dampened. Subjects were monitored around the clock and administered a strict sensory input schedule. He claimed the children stopped asking for sleep within the first 72 hours. By hour 90, they ceased referencing time at all. Their attention didn't drift. Their eye movements slowed. Heart rates remained stable. They began describing structures they could not have seen. Diagrams of rooms beneath rooms, sequences of turns without fixed geography, spaces that looped but didn't fold. The man said the walls of Building C were lined with corkboard panels to track patterns. By the end of the second week, those panels were filled. The children's drawings showed not just architecture, but annotations, directional symbols, sound timings, recurring numeric codes. Some of the codes reappeared years later in the Darnell Hollow case. Briggs had recorded them already. Key 4, Unit 0.9, Echo 4. The program was terminated in 1965, not because it failed, but because something had changed in the children's responses. One morning, the staff arrived to find all subjects awake, silent, and seated in the same formation. They hadn't spoken to one another, hadn't eaten. Every drawing submitted that day showed the same structure, a long corridor with no markings, and a central darkened space labeled only as the quiet part. No subject would explain the term. When asked, they'd smile slightly and say, "That's where we wait." Soon after, all documentation from Building C was transferred to another facility. The man never saw it again. He said the final instruction from command was not to disclose what the children had drawn, but what they had stopped drawing. Briggs asked what that meant. He replied, "They stopped drawing rooms you could exit." Then the call disconnected. Attempts to trace the number failed. The note left at her mailbox was later lost in a minor house fire. She never heard from him again. But 3 weeks later, a manila envelope was slid under the office door of the Darnell Hollow School Board. Inside were 3 diagrams, identical in style to the children's original maps, stamped in red. Section Delta, observation halted. FM 33, awake. No one claimed responsibility. The envelope was never entered into official records. By September, the town had gone quiet. 12 children were gone, no funerals, no press releases, just missing persons bulletins that slowly vanished from community corkboards and grocery store windows. The sheriff's office stopped issuing updates. The school stopped returning calls. For those still waiting, still searching, the only constant was silence. The parents of the missing tried, at first, to organize. Some gathered at the library to compare timelines, documents, photos. Others filed reports with state police or reached out to regional news desks. A few attempted to hire private investigators, but were told, gently and in similar language, that the trail is too cold for the time being. It wasn't cold, it was scrubbed. In mid-September, the calls stopped altogether. Parents began receiving identical letters in the mail. No return address, no agency seal, each printed on plain white paper using the same typeface. No salutation, just a single sentence. Your child has fulfilled their phase. Nothing more. Some parents assumed it was a prank, an act of cruelty. Others went directly to the sheriff's office with the letter in hand. The front desk officer, when presented with the note, quietly turned it face down and said, "It's not an official communication." But not one of the officers asked for a copy. A few families tried to trace the origin. The postmarks varied, all local. Some bore no stamps at all. One mother, Olivia Rains, claimed she found the envelope not in her mailbox, but slipped between the pages of a phone directory left on her porch, one she hadn't ordered and didn't recognize. The envelope inside was sealed. The contents were the same. The phrase, "fulfilled their phase," repeated in other ways. A school administrator was overheard referencing completing the observation window during a lunch conversation. A local pastor, when asked why the church wasn't holding a service for the missing, replied, "We were told their part is over. No one would say who had done the telling." In time, some parents began to question what they remembered. Not the grief, that remained, but the certainty. One father swore he had video footage of his son's last birthday, but when he played the tape, the boy was absent. Another mother insisted her daughter's handwriting had always looped her capital R's, but the last known homework assignment was printed in block letters, cold, uniform, almost stenciled. Several tried to find birth certificates, but the county clerk's office reported filing inconsistencies. Some family folders were simply missing. Others had been merged with outdated records and reassigned generic case numbers like ND401 or ENT33B. No explanation was given. A clerk was later let go for misfiling. She declined all interviews. Eventually, the parents stopped speaking in public. The library meetings dissolved. Families began moving away. Not abruptly, just quietly. Homes were listed through informal sales. Children who remained in the district were re-enrolled under adjusted last names, often living with aunts, uncles, or grandparents. One psychologist referred to the pattern as controlled erasure. Not in the literal sense, but in how the systems around the disappearances began to close up behind them, as if discouraging inquiry, not through denial, but through fatigue. The grief never found a language. At the back of the Greeley house, Marlene kept a shoebox of photographs that no longer developed properly. Faded faces, grey smudges where smiles used to be. She once tried scanning one into her computer. The preview window froze. When it refreshed, the image file had renamed itself phase complete.jpg. She never opened it again. By early October, the phrase had become almost acceptable, repeated without context, used without resistance. Your child has fulfilled their phase. No parent ever agreed to it, but not one could say what phase they'd started, or when it had begun. By October, only one child remained. His name was Nolan Green, 11 years old. Average grades, no behavioral flags. His parents had refused relocation. They withdrew him from school and kept him home, under near constant watch. Not out of fear he'd run, but because of what hadn't happened. One by one, his classmates were gone. Nolan hadn't drawn the early maps, hadn't used the code names, hadn't spoken about corridors or phases. For months, he said nothing at all. Until one morning, he asked for a ruler. His father retrieved it from a desk drawer. Nolan took it, thanked him politely, and sat down at the kitchen table with a stack of printer paper and a ballpoint pen. No coloring pencils, no drafting templates, just those three things. He worked for hours. No breaks, no corrections, just a steady hand, one line at a time. He didn't refer to notes, didn't stop to think. The lines were tight, exact, ruler straight until they weren't, breaking into curves and complex overlays that should have required math beyond his schooling. He drew dense grid clusters that opened into looping passages, rooms with no entrances, chambers with offset walls and tapered ceilings. It was not a building, it was a machine. The finished diagram stretched across 6 taped sheets, a single, seamless layout of what appeared to be a human-scale construct, not digital, not conceptual. Every inch suggested material function. There were conduit paths, ventilation marks, acoustic baffles, labeled choke points. Certain in rooms were marked only with numbers, 03, 07, 11. Others bore operational terms, echo floor, phase deepening, SPI, return. There was no legend, no directional arrow, just a small black circle at the center, shaded in completely, beside one word written in block letters, quiet. When asked what it was, Nolan didn't hesitate. He folded the map once, pressed down the crease and said, "Now it's quiet." His parents pressed further. What did the machine do? Where did it come from? He didn't explain. He only repeated the phrase, "It works now." Later that evening, Nolan placed the folded map in the mailbox, unsealed, and walked back inside. No one saw who collected it. No delivery truck came, no neighbor passed by. By morning, the map was gone. His parents filed a police report, but officers found nothing. No prints, no mail carrier. The only thing left in the box was a small metal washer, stainless steel, cold to the touch, marked with 3 faint grooves. It did not match any home appliance the family owned. In the following days, Nolan stopped drawing. He no longer reacted to questions. No tantrums, no confusion, just stillness. He was awake for 22 hours a day, seated by the window, watching the tree line beyond their backyard. When his pediatrician attempted a follow-up evaluation, Nolan's EEG showed a near-flat response. No sleep cycles, no REM patterning. But his vitals remained stable. He was, by every clinical measure, conscious, just quiet. The original map was never recovered, but fragments began surfacing elsewhere. Faint blueprints smuggled into textbooks, etched into metal desk undersides, copied by hand, and passed between children who hadn't known the missing. One set of diagrams appeared at a community college, 2 counties over. No one knew how they got there. When the staff tried to trace the source, the library copier had already purged the print log. Nolan disappeared 3 days later. His bed was cold. No struggle, no note. The only item left behind was a folded piece of paper in his desk drawer, blank on one side. On the other, a list of room numbers, printed faintly in pencil. 03, 07, 11, 13. At the bottom, in smaller handwriting, was a final line. If it hums, don't follow it. After Nolan Green disappeared, no new cases were reported. No more maps surfaced. No children were caught tracing blueprints in the margins of notebooks. Teachers stopped whispering about cold stares and quiet rows. For a moment, it felt like Darnell Hollow had returned to normal. But something else had arrived in its place. It began with the radios. In mid-October, park rangers stationed along the Boone-Kanawha boundary started reporting low-frequency interference on their shortwave channels. Faint hums beneath the chatter, followed by brief signal collapse, like a switch being flipped mid-transmission. The disturbance wasn't constant, but it was repeatable, almost rhythmic, always just after sunset, always strongest near the ridgeline south of Flatlick Hollow. When the radios cut out, they came back with a low pulse, a tone too steady to be atmospheric, too structured to be random. It held for precisely 11 seconds before fading out. The tone didn't register on analog recorders, only digital logs showed the duration. One technician who attempted to isolate the frequency described it as a voice just below recognition, like someone talking through a locked door. Then came the intercoms. Staff at Darnell Hollow Elementary had left the system on standby since the previous spring. The PA had been quiet for months, unused, forgotten, until November 1st, when a janitor closing the building heard the telltale click of the mic relay activating. It didn't broadcast words, just a gentle hum, followed by two tones, high, then low, then silence. The system clicked off after 12 seconds. At first, the incident was blamed on a faulty relay or a power surge, but it happened again the following night. Same time, 3:33 a.m., same duration. This time, a second janitor was present. Both recorded the sound on a pocket tape deck. When they played it back, the tape was blank, not erased, just absent of any waveform data. It was as if the recorder had been paused during playback. The intercom clicked on every night for 8 consecutive days. On the 9th night, it didn't hum. Instead, it whispered. Just 3 syllables, distorted, faint, reversed. When slowed and reversed again, the sound resembled a voice repeating a phrase, although no two listeners agreed on the words. Some heard, "Do not enter." Others claimed it was, "We already did." A forensic analyst brought in by the county simply wrote, "Unclassifiable verbal fragment, possibly mechanical." At the same time, police dash cam footage from 2 separate patrol vehicles began exhibiting similar interference. The recordings didn't glitch, they inserted. Mid-route, with no prompt or environmental cause, the footage would briefly distort, introducing static, then a flicker of frame-skipping imagery. What appeared resembled the interior of a narrow tunnel, a concrete corridor, no doors, no identifying marks. Each insert lasted between 4 and 7 frames, less than a third of a second. The official review logged the incidents as encoding errors, but 2 officers requested reassignment. One retired early, citing auditory recall issues during night patrol. When asked what that meant, he said he kept hearing the same sound while driving, the click before someone speaks, only they never do. Residents near the ridge began reporting signal bleed from their televisions. Sudden black screens that hummed once displayed a white rectangle, then returned to normal programming. The rectangle bore no text. It flicked, occurred once, before disappearing. A television repairman attempted to replicate the issue using signal diagnostics. He isolated a brief data spike that repeated every 88 minutes. Its signature matched the same silent intercom pulse from the school logs. He described the anomaly in plain terms. "There's a pattern now. Doesn't matter where you tune in. It's broadcasting under everything else." By winter, the town had learned to ignore it. Radios clicked, intercoms hummed, the cameras blinked when they shouldn't. But nothing more. The children were gone. What replaced them didn't take form. It just filled the space they left, quietly, patiently, without shape. The only thing anyone heard for sure was the static, and even that began to sound intentional. In the fall of 1996, nearly a decade after the disappearances, a private development group acquired a 60-acre parcel of land south of Flatlick Hollow. The firm, based out of Roanoke, planned to construct a seasonal retreat, a small, high-end campground with cabin rentals, a visitor's lodge, and limited utility infrastructure. The project was titled Phase 1, Ridgeview Commons. Initial surveys showed no issues. The land was listed as unclaimed timber zone, with no protected species and minimal slope instability. Permits were granted within 8 weeks. Logging equipment arrived the following February. By March, construction had stopped. The machines weren't malfunctioning, not in the traditional sense. The crews reported inconsistent operation, engines that cut out without warning, fuel lines that vapor-locked in mild weather, equipment that passed pre-checks in the morning and failed mid-dig by afternoon. Survey flags were found moved, compass readings spun irregularly, GPS units gave false coordinates, showing the crews over a mile west of their actual location. At first, the problems were chalked up to faulty mapping or operator error, But the inconsistencies escalated. Boreholes drilled for foundational pilings yielded no consistent material core, just shallow soil overlay and then, inexplicably, a hollow resonance. When subcontractors attempted to excavate further, ground-penetrating radar returned false positives, sudden subterranean voids that appeared, then vanished on recalibration. One night, a site foreman, John Eames, attempted to sleep in his trailer to oversee an early morning delivery. He logged his observations the next day in the project ledger. Woke up feeling like I never fell asleep. Could have sworn I heard movement outside, like pacing. When I got up and checked, there were 12 sets of footprints in the gravel. Small, children's sizes, no other tracks leading to or away. I didn't report it, not sure I want it on record. That entry was the final handwritten note in the ledger. The next day, Eames left the site. Over the following week, 5 crew members requested reassignment. 3 others quit outright. All cited the same reason in exit interviews: couldn't sleep. They described something similar, not insomnia, but an absence of the need for rest. Nights passed without dreams, without fatigue. They said their minds remained alert but motionless. One worker claimed he felt as if his body were continuing a task he hadn't been given yet. At the end of April, the development group pulled funding. No statement was issued. The site was cleared, vehicles removed. By June, only 2 trailers remained. Both padlocked, both left with key logs marked retrieved. The county later attempted to auction the land for use as an ecological preserve. There were no bids. In 2001, a separate firm proposed a small telecommunications station near the same ridgeline. The project was denied before it reached the Planning Commission. Internal notes referenced historical inconsistencies, though no details were given. One Lintones from the denial summary read, "Existing subsurface geometry remains unverified. Recommend non-intrusion." The phrase reappeared years later in an unrelated zoning report filed 200 miles north. Locals don't talk about the land anymore. Most who remember the disappearances are gone, relocated or retired. The few who remain keep the stories quiet, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. No conclusions were reached. No markers remain. The only sign left standing is a utility pole with no wires, leaning slightly eastward. Still, hikers occasionally pass through the edge of the ridge trail and report hearing something strange. Not voices exactly, and not footsteps either. Just the sound of weight moving through gravel in a straight line, measured, repeating, as if someone, or something, was walking in a sequence. When asked what time it happens, the answers vary, but always after dark, always without warning, and always followed by the same phrase, spoken without context, by those who heard it. I wasn't tired, but I should have been. If cases like these slip quietly through the cracks, how many more were never meant to be found? Subscribe for more unearthed files, buried histories, and the stories they were never supposed to finish writing. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Tell us in the comments below.